The moment hung in the air, the sound of the cup hitting the table, coffee splashing, gasps forming too late. Grace stood frozen, her red blouse clinging to her as the hot liquid spread down her sleeves. The laughter came slowly at first, then louder, freer, cruel in its ease. The cup rolled in a lazy circle before stopping near her feet, a tiny echo of humiliation. "Guess she's not our type," someone said, and the words sliced through her composure like glass. Grace blinked, her breath catching, her face burning hotter than the spill itself. The laughter grew. It had rhythm now, like a cruel applause. She looked around the room, at faces that used to smile back at her, now strangers behind polite amusement. Her hands trembled as she reached for a napkin. The brown stain spread wider with every touch, refusing to fade. Her reflection in the window stared back, broken by the streaks of coffee dripping down the glass. She whispered, "It's okay," though. She knew it wasn't. The air smelled bitter, burnt coffee, guilt, and something darker. Martin leaned on the edge of the table, smirking. "Come on, Grace," he said. "Can't you take a joke?" His words rolled off his tongue as easily as the laughter he had started. The two women nearby chuckled again, softer now, afraid to stop, but too human to keep laughing. Grace kept her eyes on the stain, her silence a thin wall holding back tears. Time stretched. Every second felt heavy and slow, like a clock refusing to move forward. Grace's heart pounded in her ears, drowning out the murmurs. Then, footsteps, firm, measured, unmistakable. The laughter thinned. Someone straightened their posture. Grace didn't look up. She already felt the change in the room. The CEO stood at the doorway. No words, no raised voice, just the kind of silence that demands attention. His gaze swept the room, calm but cutting. The same. People who had laughed now looked down, trapped in their own reflections of guilt. He moved closer, and the air seemed to bow beneath his presence. Without a word, he took off his jacket and placed it over Grace's shoulders. The fabric was still warm, carrying the scent of cedar and quiet authority. She froze, unsure if she should thank him or cry. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, too calm. "If cruelty is what passes for humor here," he said, "then we've forgotten what it means to be human." The sentence lingered like smoke after a fire. No one dared to breathe. Martin's grin vanished, his confidence collapsing under the weight of decency. Grace's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her hands gripped the edges of the jacket, as if holding on to something sacred, or perhaps something she had been denied all along: dignity. The CEO turned, his steps slow and deliberate, leaving behind a silence that echoed louder than laughter. Grace remained standing, trembling, the stain still visible beneath the jacket, a quiet proof of what had been done and what could never be undone. Yet behind the humiliation, a spark flickered, faint but alive. And as the door closed behind him, Grace lifted her eyes to the reflection in the glass, and for the first time she didn't see a victim. She saw someone the world had underestimated. The laughter had died, but something greater had begun to awaken, quietly, patiently, waiting for its moment to return. The restroom mirror caught her reflection, like a wound frozen in time. Grace stood beneath the harsh fluorescent light, jacket still draped over her shoulders, the fabric too fine for someone like her. Steam rose faintly from the sink where she'd been rinsing the stain, but it clung stubbornly, like the memory itself. She pressed a wet paper towel against the fabric, watching the brown water swirl away. It didn't help. The hurt wasn't on the cloth. Her fingers trembled as she unbuttoned her blouse, the red now darker, damp and cold. The air smelled faintly of soap and sadness. She breathed in through her nose and exhaled slowly, counting the seconds like a prayer. Somewhere beyond the door, keyboards clicked and laughter tried to pretend nothing had happened. But she knew. They had all seen. Grace leaned closer to the mirror. Her eyes looked older, like they belonged to someone who had lived through something unfair and grown because of it. "Don't cry," she whispered, the words barely sound, almost breath. A tear betrayed her anyway, slipping down her cheek and landing on the porcelain sink with a quiet, cruel echo. She thought of the moment, the cup, the laughter, the CEO's voice. It all played in her mind again, but slower this time, softer, as if trying to make sense of what mercy had just intervened. The jacket on her shoulders was heavy, warm still, like borrowed courage. For the first time that morning, she closed her eyes and let the silence hold her. Outside, footsteps passed, brisk, careless, unaware of the storm they'd left behind. Grace felt her body stiffen, but the fear didn't reach her heart anymore. Something inside her had shifted, subtle but real. She wasn't angry, not yet, only hollow, as if her kindness had been drained out, drop by drop. She sat down on the small bench by the lockers, hands clasped tight in her lap. The memory of the laughter looped in her mind, but now she could see their faces more clearly. The hesitation, the guilt, the cracks behind the smiles. Maybe not all of them wanted to laugh. Maybe some of them were just afraid not to. That thought gave her breath again. The sound of water dripping from the faucet became a rhythm, like time marking her thoughts. Grace reached for her phone, opened a note she used for prayers, and typed one line, "Let me stay kind, even when they are not." Her thumb hovered for a moment before she pressed save. The words felt small, but they were hers. She stood up slowly, fixing her blouse as best she could, the CEO's jacket still resting on her shoulders like an armor of decency. Her face was pale, but her eyes had steadied, the tremor gone. She opened the door, letting the scent of coffee and paper rush back in, carrying the taste of reality with it. As she walked past the desks, whispers tried to hide behind screens. No one met her gaze, not even Martin. Grace didn't need them to. She walked to her seat, sat down, and turned on her computer as if nothing had happened. The screen glowed softly, a small light in a room full of silence. And yet, beneath that silence, something new had begun to grow. A stillness that wasn't weakness, but composure. Grace didn't know it yet, but the way she carried herself in that moment, calm, upright, and wordless, would be remembered far. Longer than the laughter that had tried to break her. Before the laughter, before the stain, there was warmth. The office had been quiet then, filled with the soft hum of computers and the gentle clatter of mugs in the morning. Grace would arrive early, unlocking the glass doors before sunrise, greeting the empty lobby with a whispered, "Good morning." It wasn't habit. It was gratitude. She believed kindness had weight, even when no one saw it. Her desk faced the elevators. Every morning she arranged a small vase with fresh daisies, her favorite, simple, persistent, alive. She'd place a sticky note beside the coffee machine with a cheerful message, "Today will be kind if we are." At first people smiled at that. They took their coffee slower, said thank you louder. For a while, Grace believed her small warmth had changed something. Martin joined the company 3 months later. Sharp suits, sharper words. He smiled with the kind of charm that filled the room, but emptied it afterward. Grace had tried to welcome him the same way she welcomed everyone, a cup of black coffee, just the way he liked it. He'd accepted it with a smirk and said, "Careful, or people will start expecting too much from you." She had laughed then, not knowing what he meant. Over time, the jokes became smaller, lighter, but pointed, like paper cuts. "Grace, our in-house angel," he'd say in meetings, smiling for the others. She'd blush, smile politely, not realizing the laughter that followed wasn't admiration, but amusement. The warmth she carried into the room seemed to make some people uncomfortable, especially him. Still, she never stopped trying. On rainy days, she'd leave spare umbrellas by the door. When someone looked tired, she'd refill their coffee before they asked. Her kindness wasn't loud, it was steady, the kind that grows roots quietly in cold soil. She didn't expect anything back, but sometimes she wished someone would see her, really see her. There were moments when it seemed they did. The older accountant, Mrs. Hughes, once told her, "You make this place feel less like a job." Grace had smiled so wide it hurt, but moments like that faded quickly beneath Martin's smirks and teasing remarks. His words had a way of rewriting the atmosphere, turning gratitude into something naive, something to mock. Little by little, Grace noticed the shift. Her morning greetings were returned with nods instead of smiles. Her notes on the coffee machine went unread. The daisies wilted faster. She told herself people were just busy, that kindness wasn't meant to be noticed, only felt. But a small ache began to grow, one she didn't name yet. She started bringing 2 coffees to the front desk, one for herself, one for whoever might stop by to talk. Some mornings, no one did. Still, she kept the second cup. Warm, waiting. It became her quiet ritual, a reminder that hope, even unreturned, was still worth brewing. And though she didn't know it, Martin watched her sometimes, not with admiration, but with something sharper. The kind of irritation that kindness stirs in people who mistake empathy for weakness. Behind his smile, resentment brewed slowly, like coffee left too long on the burner. That was how it all began. Not with anger, but with envy disguised as laughter. Grace's warmth had been too steady, too real, and in a place built on ego, that was the most dangerous thing of all. She would only realize it much later, when the laughter finally turned cruel. The change was slow, almost invisible at first. Martin began skipping her morning greetings, pretending not to hear when she said hello. In meetings, he'd interrupt her politely, always with a smile that others mistook for charm. "Let's stay on topic," he'd say, as if her words were clutter in the air. Grace learned to fold her voice smaller, speaking less, listening more. He never raised his voice, that would have been too obvious. Instead, his cruelty came dressed in civility. "Grace, next time make sure the reports are stapled correctly," he'd murmur, even when they already were. "Attention to detail is everything." His tone was calm, instructive, but his eyes told another story, one of quiet pleasure in making her shrink. The others followed the rhythm he set, unspoken but understood. When Martin made a joke, they laughed. When he ignored Grace, they did too. She noticed how conversations hushed when she walked into the room, how laughter resumed when she walked out. It was isolation, by 1,000 tiny cuts, and no one seemed to notice she was bleeding. One afternoon, while handing out folders, she overheard him whisper, "Too nice for her own good." The words weren't cruel on their surface, but in his voice, they twisted into something poisonous. Grace paused, folders trembling slightly in her hands. She smiled anyway, because she still believed that kindness could disarm disdain. At lunch, she sat alone in the break room, her sandwich untouched. The sound of laughter drifted from another table. That same brittle laughter she had learned to fear. She wondered if it was about her, but the wondering hurt more than knowing. Outside, rain pressed softly against the windows, tapping in rhythm with her thoughts. Ben, the janitor, passed by and gave her a quiet nod. "Keep your chin up, Miss Grace," he said, setting down the mop. "Storms don't last forever." His kindness broke something in her, not sadness, but relief. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe. The world wasn't entirely cruel, not yet. Later that week, Martin made a new rule: no personal items on desks. "We're professionals, not decorators," he announced. Grace's daisies were gone by morning, the vase tucked into a drawer by someone who thought they were following orders. The corner of her desk felt colder, emptier, as if light itself had dimmed a little. Her silence became his favorite victory. The more she retreated, the more confident he became. He laughed louder in meetings, his jokes sharper, his presence larger. Grace smiled through it, a quiet defiance that no one recognized as strength. Each time she said, "Thank you," she meant, "I won't let you change me." But there are limits even to kindness. And though she didn't know it yet, Martin was about to test hers in a way that would leave no room for silence. The prank that would follow, cruel, deliberate, humiliating, was already forming in his mind like a storm gathering on the horizon. And so the laughter began to sharpen its edges, waiting for the day it would finally cut deep. Grace still believed the world rewarded gentleness, and soon she would learn how painfully slow that reward can be. If this story moved you, leave a heart in the comments, like the video, and share it with someone who still believes in kindness, because empathy is stronger when we pass it on. The next morning came quietly, like the world itself was trying not to disturb her. Grace arrived early again, unlocking the doors with hands that still remembered trembling. The scent of fresh polish and paper filled the lobby. She stood there for a moment, just breathing, as if testing whether her heart still trusted this place. Outside, the dawn light touched the windows, soft and forgiving. She went about her routine in silence, one coffee cup, then another. The machine hummed like a lullaby she'd grown up with. There was comfort in repetition, in doing what was right, even when no one cared. Grace believed that every small act of care was a seed, and one day something good would grow from it. Ben passed by, pushing his cart of cleaning supplies. He gave her a small smile, the kind that didn't need words. "You're here early again," he said. "Habit," she replied, returning the smile. He nodded slowly. "It's a good habit. The world's loud enough. We need quiet hearts." His voice carried a wisdom that made her eyes soften. They spoke little after that, but his presence lingered like warmth. Each morning he'd leave a small folded note near the reception counter. Just a word or two. "Keep shining." They don't see, but he does. Grace never mentioned it, but she kept them all in a drawer beside her daisies, pressed flat like prayers between pages. Her workdays remained the same, Martin's glances, the quiet snickers, but her heart no longer bent so easily. Whenever the noise grew too sharp, she'd touch one of those notes in her pocket, and it steadied her breathing. Hope didn't roar, it whispered, and she was learning to listen. One afternoon, while everyone else was at lunch, she walked through the empty office. The light fell in perfect lines across the desks, dust floating in the beams like suspended thoughts. She straightened the chairs, aligned the papers, and smiled to herself. "Kindness keeps things in order," she murmured, not as a duty, but as a truth. She thought of her mother then, how she used to say that good hearts always leave light behind, even in dark places. Grace missed her. Maybe that's why she gave so much, because giving was the only way she knew how to stay close to her. That thought didn't make her sad. It made her still. Later, Ben returned, whistling softly. "You ever notice," he said, "that flowers grow even through cracks in the pavement?" Grace looked at him puzzled until he pointed to the window, a small plant sprouting from the edge of the concrete below. She smiled, the first real smile in days. Guess that's Hope's way of saying it's stubborn. When she sat back at her desk, she found another note waiting under her keyboard. This one said, "Gentleness isn't weakness, it's endurance." Grace held it for a long moment, tracing the words with her finger. For the first time since that awful morning, she felt her chest lift, not with pride, but with quiet strength. The laughter hadn't stopped, the world hadn't changed, but Grace had, just enough to keep going, just enough to keep believing that kindness, however small, still mattered. And in that belief, a new kind of courage was born, the kind that begins softly and ends up saving everything. By Friday, laughter had found its way back into the office, louder, meaner, forced. Martin had started something he called Funny Friday, a weekly ritual where jokes were encouraged and sensitivity was forbidden. "We need lighter moods," he said, grinning. But everyone knew the laughter had a target, and her name was Grace. It began with whispers. "Don't spill your coffee, Grace," one voice teased as she walked by. Another added, "Check your mug first." She smiled faintly, pretending not to hear. Pretending was easier than fighting. At least that's what she told herself. But inside, the words left marks, invisible but deep. Martin turned every task into theatre. "Grace, could you smile for us? The office feels gloomy without it." The others laughed, relieved it wasn't them. Grace obeyed, with a soft smile, her lips trembling as she forced the corners upward. She wondered if they could see the cost of that smile, if any of them cared. The cruelest thing about ridicule is not the noise, it's the echo afterward. It stays long after the laughter fades, like the ring of a bell that no one else hears. Grace would return home at night, stare at her reflection, and ask softly, "What did I do wrong by being kind?" The silence never answered. Monday arrived with the same polished routine, coffee brewing, phones ringing, papers shuffling, yet beneath it all was tension, a quiet dread she could taste in the air. Grace carried on, every movement careful, measured, dignified. She knew they were watching, waiting for her to falter again. Ben noticed. He always did. One morning, as he emptied the trash bin near her desk, he whispered, "You know, storms test roots, not petals." She looked up, meeting his kind, steady eyes. "Maybe," she said softly, "but petals still get torn." Ben smiled, "and yet they keep blooming." His words stayed with her long after he left. That day, Martin made another joke during the meeting, something about the coffee queen. Laughter erupted again, sharper this time. Grace's chest tightened, but she kept her gaze fixed on her notes. Every chuckle sounded like thunder in her ears. Still, she didn't flinch. If dignity was all she had left, she would wear it like armor. The cruelty became predictable, and that made it easier to bear. Grace learned to retreat inside herself, to that quiet place where Ben's words lived and the memory of her mother's warmth still lingered. They could mock her gestures, her kindness, her smile, but not her peace. That belonged to her alone. Still, peace was heavy to carry. Every act of restraint felt like a weight pressing against her ribs. There were moments she wanted to shout, to ask why kindness had become something to laugh at, but the words never came. The same voice that told her to stay gentle also told her to endure. And so she endured, steady, patient, unknowingly walking toward the day when all the laughter would stop. The day the office would learn that kindness may bend, but it never breaks. That day was closer than anyone imagined. The morning began like any other. Soft music from the lobby radio, the hum of printers waking with the light. Grace arrived earlier than usual, her blouse freshly pressed, her heart steady. She carried 2 cups of coffee, as always, one for herself, one for Martin. "Good morning," she said gently as she set his on the table. He didn't look up, but a thin smile curved his lips. The office slowly filled with chatter, chairs rolling, phones ringing. Grace poured her own coffee, unaware of the faint glimmer of mischief in Martin's eyes. He leaned toward a colleague and whispered something that made them both laugh under their breath. From across the room, it looked harmless, just morning banter. but cruelty rarely looks dangerous before it strikes. Grace sat at her desk, taking small sips as she sorted the mail. Her heart was calm, her smile faint but true. Martin watched her from his office doorway, holding an identical mug in his hand, or so it seemed. When she turned to answer the phone, he quietly switched her cup for another identical one resting on the counter. No one noticed. No one ever did. Minutes later, the team gathered for the weekly meeting. Grace joined them, notebook in hand, unaware of the trap waiting on the table. Martin gestured to her seat with false politeness. "Our favorite smile is here," he said, prompting a few chuckles. She sat down gracefully, setting her cup in front of her. The air felt ordinary, safe. Halfway through the meeting, she lifted the mug. The moment stretched, a single second too long, before it broke. The coffee poured through the bottom, splashing down her blouse, burning hot against her skin. She gasped, trying to contain it, but the pain was too sharp, too sudden. Papers fell, someone laughed, then another and another. The laughter rose, uncontrolled, echoing off the glass walls like applause at a cruel play. Grace froze, her eyes wide, her breath caught. "Oh no," someone said through a laugh. "Not again." The sound blurred, laughter, voices, chaos, until it was just noise. The smell of coffee and shame filled the air. She stood there, trembling. Martin clapped once. "Come on, Grace," he said, pretending innocence. "It's just a joke. Don't make it awkward." His words sliced through her composure, sharp as glass. The laughter dimmed, but the damage was done. Grace looked around at faces that had once smiled at her, now turned into strangers. Her throat burned as she whispered, "It's fine," though nothing was. She reached for a napkin, her hands shaking. The brown liquid dripped from her sleeves onto the floor, each drop sounding louder than the laughter. The world blurred at the edges, light, sound, breath, all fading into a hollow silence inside her chest. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate. The laughter died instantly. Grace didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The room's air changed, heavy, reverent. The CEO stood at the doorway, his expression unreadable. In that stillness, time itself seemed to hold its breath. He walked forward, removed his jacket, and placed it gently over her shoulders. His voice was calm, low, steady. "If cruelty is what passes for humor here," he said, "then we've forgotten what it means to be human." And in that silence, thicker than shame, Grace realized something powerful. She was no longer alone in her pain. The city was quiet that night, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, as if even the wind didn't want to disturb her thoughts. Grace sat at her kitchen table, the light dim, her uniform hanging from the chair beside her. Still stained, still smelling faintly of coffee, she traced the fabric with her fingers, watching the brown marks fade into darkness. It wasn't just a stain anymore. It was a reminder. Her apartment was small, tidy, filled with the soft order she'd always loved. The kind of place where things stayed where they belonged. But that night even her home felt foreign, as if the laughter from the office had followed her through the door. She poured herself tea, but the cup stayed untouched. Her reflection in the window looked like a stranger she didn't know how to comfort. She tried to pray, but the words came out thin, broken. "Why does kindness always hurt first?" she whispered, staring at her hands. Her mother's voice echoed in memory. "Because kind people carry more light than they know, and light always attracts shadows." The thought made her smile faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. For a long time, she just sat there, listening to the tick of the wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the silence pressing against her chest. Every sound seemed louder in that loneliness. She thought of quitting, of leaving it all behind. No more jokes, no more stares, no more pretending to smile when it burned inside. But then she remembered the jacket, The CEO's jacket folded neatly on her couch. She hadn't washed it yet. She couldn't. It still smelled of cedar and strength, a scent that felt like protection. She stood, crossed the room, and lifted it gently. Her fingers brushed against the fabric, and something inside her steadied. Maybe not everyone had laughed. She sat on the couch, pulling the jacket close around her shoulders. The warmth of it made her eyes close. She saw again the look on the CEO's face. Not anger, not pity, just quiet disappointment. It was as if his silence had said, "You matter, Grace. Don't let them define what's good." That thought settled in her chest like a small, steady flame. Outside, rain began to fall. Drops traced slow lines down the window, the sound rhythmic and forgiving. Grace leaned her head against the cushion and let the rhythm soothe her. Every drop seemed to whisper, "You did nothing wrong." It was the first sound of peace she'd heard all day. She opened her phone, scrolling mindlessly, until a new email notification appeared. The sender's name made her sit upright, Mr. Allen, CEO. Her heart skipped. She opened it, hands trembling. "Grace, if you're free tomorrow morning, I'd like to see you for a brief conversation. No pressure. Just coffee." Her breath caught. She read it twice, 3 times, afraid it might disappear. The same word, coffee, that had humiliated her days ago now carried the possibility of healing. She closed her phone slowly, holding it to her chest, eyes glistening. For the first time in days, her tears didn't come from pain. That night, she didn't pray for courage. She thanked God for it. The city outside kept raining, but inside her small apartment, a quiet calm returned. The storm hadn't passed yet, but she finally understood. Storms don't always come to destroy. Sometimes they just clear the air. The next morning, Grace woke before the alarm. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and pale. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, touching her face with warmth she hadn't felt in days. She sat up slowly, her heart uncertain but hopeful. The email replayed in her mind like a promise she didn't dare believe. She dressed simply, a cream blouse, her hair tied back neatly, and folded the CEO's jacket over her arm. Holding it felt strange, like carrying both shame and gratitude in the same breath. On her way to the office, she rehearsed what to say. "Thank you, I'm sorry, I'll resign." None of it sounded right. Words seemed too small for what the silence between them had meant. When she arrived, the building felt different, quieter, almost reverent. A few colleagues nodded, hesitant, unsure how to look at her. Grace returned their glances with calm politeness. She didn't carry bitterness in her walk, only a stillness that made people lower their eyes. Sometimes dignity makes more noise than anger ever could. The receptionist from another floor led her to the executive lounge, a room she'd never entered before. Sunlight poured through tall windows, touching the marble floor like gold. The CEO stood by the counter, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "Good morning, Grace," he said gently. "I'm glad you came." His tone wasn't corporate, it was human. He handed her a cup, sturdy, simple, unbroken. "Don't worry," he smiled softly. "This one's safe." The small joke broke the ice, and she laughed quietly, the sound shaky but real. For a moment, she saw not a CEO, but a man who understood. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit, please." "I wanted to apologize," he said. "What happened shouldn't have happened under my roof." Grace looked down, fingers tightening around the cup. "It's not your fault, sir," she murmured. He shook his head. "Maybe not the act, but the culture? That starts with me, and that's what needs to change." His voice carried both regret and resolve. For a while, they sat in silence, sipping coffee. The warmth seeped into her hands, soothing the ache she hadn't realized she still carried. "You remind me of someone," he said finally. "My mother." She ran a small diner when I was a boy. She treated everyone with kindness, even when they didn't deserve it. I used to think it made her weak." He paused. "Now I know it made her strong." Grace blinked back tears. No one had ever spoken of kindness as strength before. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was starting to think maybe I was foolish for caring." The CEO smiled gently. "Don't ever think that. People may mock gentleness, but they always remember it. You can't humiliate what is truly good, only reveal who isn't." When she left his office, the sunlight felt different, brighter, fuller. She carried his words with her, as if they'd restored something she had lost, but not forgotten. Passing through the lobby, she caught her reflection in the glass doors. Shoulders back, head high. The stain on her heart had not disappeared, but it no longer defined her. And for the first time since that morning, Grace smiled, not the polite smile of endurance, but the quiet one of someone who knows her worth. The world outside hadn't changed, but the way she walked through it had. And that, she realized, was the beginning of all true change. The following week unfolded differently. The air inside the office felt lighter, though no one could explain why. Grace still arrived early, unlocking the doors with her familiar gentleness. But now her presence carried quiet authority. The CEO had begun appearing on the floor more often, not to monitor, but to listen. People noticed. They straightened their backs when he passed, aware that something unseen had shifted. One morning, a new board appeared on the wall near the break room. Its heading read, "Morning Gratitude." A note beneath said, "Start the day by writing one thing you're thankful for." No one claimed credit, but everyone knew where the idea had come from. Grace smiled when she saw it, her eyes softening. By noon, the board was filled with scribbles: coffee, family, health, small mercies. The change was subtle at first. More greetings, fewer whispers. The same voices that once laughed began to sound gentler. Even laughter itself seemed to rediscover its warmth. Martin watched all this from his office window, his smile thinning each day. He didn't like this new softness. It made his authority feel smaller, less certain. Grace noticed him watching, but chose not to react. She no longer tried to win him over or avoid him. Her silence wasn't fear anymore, it was peace. She brought daisies back to her desk, bright yellow ones this time. When she placed them in the vase, someone stopped to say, "Nice touch, Grace." Just 3 words, but they mattered. Ben passed by and nodded approvingly. "Looks like the flowers are winning," he said with a grin. Grace laughed softly. Maybe they always were. They just needed light. Her laughter carried, faint but healing, filling the corners where shame once lived. It wasn't triumph. It was something purer, quiet restoration. During a staff meeting, the CEO introduced a new initiative, Kindness Month. "Not a campaign," he said, "a culture." His eyes flicked briefly to Grace, but she looked down humbly. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was sincere. For the first time, laughter filled the room without wounding anyone. Martin clapped along with the others, but his hands felt heavy. He watched Grace from across the table, her calmness, her poise, her quiet influence. Something about it unsettled him. Kindness, he realized, could command respect without force. And that truth frightened him more than any reprimand could have. Later that day, Grace walked through the office, reading the gratitude notes. Someone had written, "To the receptionist who makes this place feel human again." She stopped, her throat tightening. She didn't know who wrote it, and maybe it didn't matter. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen for the right reasons. She stood by the board, pen in hand, and added her own note. "Grateful for second chances, even the quiet ones." The words looked small among the others, but they glowed in the light. When she stepped back, she saw her reflection in the glass. The same woman, but not the same heart. And in that reflection, Grace finally understood. Change doesn't come from shouting at cruelty. It comes from living gently in its face until it runs out of breath. The world had tried to make her smaller, but kindness, real kindness, had made her larger instead. The days that followed carried an unfamiliar quiet, not the tense silence of fear, but the calm before a reckoning. The office had changed. People smiled more, worked softer, yet something restless moved beneath the surface. Martin felt it most of all. His jokes fell flat now, his charm unreciprocated. The laughter that once followed him had shifted its loyalty elsewhere, toward peace, toward grace. He told himself it was temporary, that kindness couldn't last, that people would return to what was easy. But they didn't. The gratitude board grew each morning, covered in honest scrawls and quiet apologies, disguised as thanks. One note read, "For the courage to stay kind when the world laughed." It wasn't signed, but Martin knew who it was for, and that knowledge burned. He began to retreat into bitterness. Behind closed doors, he mocked the change in emails to a few close colleagues, writing lines like, "Welcome to the Church of Grace, where guilt is free with every cup of coffee." The words were meant as a joke, but cruelty, once written, has a way of keeping its own receipts. It was the HR team that found them first. A new compliance audit, routine, impersonal, flagged the messages for review. The screenshots landed quietly in the CEO's inbox, each one a small window into the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. He read them slowly, his expression unreadable, each line confirming what he already suspected. The next morning, Grace arrived as usual. She watered her daisies, smiled at Ben, and started her day. Nothing seemed different, but whispers had already begun to circulate. People felt the shift, that strange anticipation that fills a room before a storm. She didn't know it yet, but the air around her was thick with justice preparing its voice. Martin sensed it too. The moment he walked into the office, he felt eyes on him. Brief, hesitant, unreadable. His inbox was empty except for one new message, meeting at 3 p.m., executive floor. No reason, no context. His stomach tightened. He laughed it off out loud, but his hands shook as he typed his morning emails. Throughout the day, Grace noticed the tension in the air. Conversations cut short when she entered, nervous smiles, glances exchanged. It was a feeling she'd known before, except this time it wasn't directed at her. Something was shifting, but she couldn't tell what. All she knew was that the energy felt strangely familiar, the kind that precedes truth. When the clock struck 3, the elevator doors closed behind Martin with a metallic sigh. Grace watched from her desk as the numbers lit up, one by one, until they disappeared at the top floor. A strange stillness filled her chest. She didn't know why, but she whispered a small prayer, not for herself, but for him. Upstairs, the boardroom was silent except for the soft rustle of papers. The CEO slid a folder across the table. "Is that your writing, Martin?" he asked quietly. Martin looked down at the printed emails, the jokes, the words soaked in arrogance. The color drained from his face. "It was humor," he stammered. "Just humor." The CEO nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "the same kind that made a woman cry in front of this company." His tone wasn't harsh, it was weary, heavy with disappointment. "You taught people to laugh at kindness. Now they'll learn what it costs." And with that, silence filled the room, a silence thicker than guilt, heavier than anger. The next morning began with unease. The office buzzed with the quiet hum of whispers, not cruel ones this time, but cautious, nervous. People moved slower, spoke softer. The news had spread, though no one dared to name it aloud. A meeting had been called by the CEO. Mandatory. 9 a.m. sharp. No one knew why, but everyone suspected. Grace arrived early as always. The daisies on her desk had bloomed overnight, their yellow brighter against the pale morning light. She felt the tension in the air but didn't question it. She only prayed silently that whatever was coming would bring peace, not revenge. She had learned that justice without compassion becomes cruelty in another disguise. By 9, the entire team had gathered in the main conference room. The air was still, the kind of stillness that comes before confession. The CEO stood at the head of the table, calm and composed. Martin sat among them, his jaw tight, his eyes down. Grace slipped into the last seat by the wall, unnoticed by most. The CEO began simply, "Lately, I've been thinking about the kind of people we become when we stop seeing each other." His voice was low, deliberate. "And I've realized that the worst thing cruelty does is not hurt. It teaches others that hurting is acceptable." The room stayed silent. Every word seemed to echo against the walls. He lifted a few printed pages from the table. "Some of you may think humor excuses harm. It doesn't. I've read things written under this company's name that don't belong here. They don't belong anywhere decency still breathes." His gaze passed over the faces in the room, lingering for a heartbeat on Martin. Martin shifted in his chair, the faint sound of his breath louder than any whisper. "Sir," he began, voice breaking, "those were jokes, just poor judgment, nothing more." The CEO tilted his head slightly. "Poor judgment," he repeated softly. "A coffee cup with a hole, emails mocking Grace. That's not judgment, Martin. That's a pattern." No one moved. Grace's hands trembled on her lap, but her face stayed calm. She didn't want revenge. She wanted understanding. The CEO looked around again, then said, "If cruelty became humor here, then we've forgotten what it means to be human." The same words he had spoken that day. But this time, they carried the weight of justice fulfilled. Martin's eyes glistened, shame cutting deeper than pride could hide. "I didn't mean—" he started, but the sentence died before it reached the air. The CEO shook his head. "Intent doesn't heal wounds, Martin. Only remorse does. And remorse begins with silence." His tone was neither cruel nor kind. It was final. Grace felt tears gather, not for herself, but for the sadness of it all. How quickly people forget to care. The CEO turned to her. "Grace," he said gently, "you taught us something without ever trying to. You reminded this place that humanity isn't written in policies, it's practiced in small acts every day." A murmur of agreement spread through the room like a soft wave. For the first time, Martin looked up and met her eyes. There was no defense left in him, only regret. Grace gave a faint nod, not out of triumph, but forgiveness beginning to take shape. The CEO's voice broke the silence once more. "Let this room remember today not as punishment, but as awakening." And with that, the meeting ended. No applause, no speeches, only quiet reflection. People stood slowly, as if afraid to break the new peace that had settled over them. Grace remained seated for a moment longer, her gaze on the daisies visible through the glass wall. They looked untouched by the storm. And somehow, so was she. The morning after the meeting, the office felt lighter, though no one could say why. The laughter hadn't returned yet, but something better had. Quiet respect. Grace noticed it in the small gestures. Doors held open, greetings spoken softly, eyes that no longer looked through her, but at her. Kindness had begun to echo, not from her alone, but from the hearts it had reached. Martin came in late. He moved quietly, his usual confidence stripped away, replaced by a hesitant calm. When he passed Grace's desk, she looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since the incident. There was no anger in her gaze, only stillness. He froze mid-step, unsure whether to speak. She offered a faint smile. "Good morning, Martin." The words disarmed him. Simple, ordinary, yet they carried the weight of mercy. "Morning," he murmured, his voice barely audible. He stood there a moment longer, then placed a small paper cup on her desk. "Coffee," he said softly. "No tricks this time." Grace looked at it, then at him and nodded. "I believe you." He returned to his desk, shoulders heavy but lighter than before. The office watched, silent but moved. It wasn't spectacle. It was healing in plain sight. Grace lifted the cup, took a sip and smiled faintly. The bitterness was gone. From the coffee, from the air, from her heart. Forgiveness, she realized, tasted warmer than any revenge ever could. Later that afternoon, the CEO stopped by her desk. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Grace hesitated, then said, "Better. Thank you for standing up when it mattered." He shook his head. "You're the one who stood tall. I only followed." His smile was small but proud, the kind a father might give a daughter he respects. As he walked away, Grace looked around the office. The gratitude board had grown again, more colorful, more sincere. Someone had written, "To the courage of a kind woman." Another said, "Thank you for reminding us who we are." Her eyes welled, but she didn't wipe the tears. Some emotions are meant to be seen. Martin approached again near closing time. His hands were trembling as he placed a small folded letter on her desk. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. "I owe you the truth. I was cruel because you had something I didn't. Peace. I mocked what I envied." His eyes glistened. "I'm sorry." Grace unfolded the note after he left. Inside, a single line read, "Thank you for not becoming like us." She pressed it to her heart, a tear falling onto the paper, blurring the ink slightly. She whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for him, that he might find the same peace he once tried to take from her. As the sun set, the office glowed with amber light. People left quietly, their reflections stretching across the glass floor. Grace stayed a moment longer, watching the last rays fall over her daisies. They had bloomed again, taller now, stronger. It felt symbolic, almost divine. When she finally stood to leave, she turned off the light and looked back at her desk. The jacket, the flowers, the board, all simple things, yet each one held a story of courage, of kindness, of grace. For the first time, she understood why her name suited her so perfectly. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the office softened. The sharp edges of conversation had rounded. Voices sounded kinder, lighter. The same walls that once echoed with mockery now carried laughter that didn't hurt anymore. Grace could feel it in the air. Something invisible but alive, like peace finally learning how to stay. Every morning, the gratitude board filled faster. New handwriting appeared daily, messages that spoke of change. For second chances. For people who teach without trying. For grace. She never signed her own name, but her spirit was written in every note. The board had become a mirror of what she'd given, gentleness reborn in others. Martin had changed too. He spoke less, listened more. His tone had lost the arrogance that once shadowed it. One morning he brought fresh daisies to replace the ones on Grace's desk. "For the sunlight you brought here," he said almost shyly. She smiled, touched not by the gesture itself, but by what it meant, humility blooming where pride once lived. Ben watched all of this quietly, like a gardener proud of a field he helped tend. "Told you," he said one afternoon as he passed her desk. "Storms don't last forever." Grace smiled warmly. "No," she said, "but sometimes they wash the world clean." His laughter echoed down the hall, deep and content. The CEO's presence remained steady but subtle. He no longer needed to watch closely. The culture had begun to heal itself. On Fridays, he would stop by the break room, pour himself coffee, and add his own note to the board. Always unsigned, but Grace knew his handwriting. It usually said something simple, like "grateful for courage," disguised as kindness. Grace's desk had become a quiet sanctuary. The daisies stood taller now, bathed in morning light. Beside them, a framed photo of her mother, smiling, proud. Some days she'd whisper, "We did it," before starting work. Not I, but we. Because Grace knew she hadn't stood alone. Every small act of goodness that had once seemed invisible now felt connected, like threads of light weaving the place back together. Employees began bringing treats to share on Mondays, starting the week with warmth instead of dread. Someone started a thank you chain in the company chat. Even Martin joined in, sending messages of appreciation that made people smile instead of flinch. Change wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, steady, real. One afternoon, Grace found a sealed envelope on her desk. Her name was written in careful handwriting, the CEO's. She held it for a long moment, unsure whether to open it. The last time he'd written to her, it had changed everything. This time, she sensed it carried something even deeper, a kind of closing note. She slipped the envelope into her purse, deciding to open it later, when the office was empty. For now, she wanted to finish her work, to enjoy the quiet hum of peace around her. The sound of laughter from the break room made her smile. This time, it was laughter that healed. The sun began to lower, painting gold across the walls. Grace stood and watered the daisies, humming softly. Around her, the office breathed as one, no longer wounded, no longer cruel, just human. She didn't know it yet, but the letter in her purse would be the last piece of this story, and its most beautiful one. The office was quiet when the clock struck 6. Everyone had gone home, leaving behind the soft hum of computers and the faint scent of coffee that lingered in the air. Grace sat alone at her desk, the golden light of sunset washing over the daisies. The letter still rested in her purse, waiting patiently, as if it knew when its time would come. She took it out slowly, running her fingers over the paper. The envelope was sealed with the company's insignia, but the handwriting was personal, careful, deliberate. She hesitated for a moment, then broke the seal. Inside, one page, folded neatly in half. Her heart beat slower as she opened it. "Grace," it began, "sometimes leadership isn't about decisions, it's about reminders. You reminded us of who we are when we forget. You reminded me that strength isn't in power, but in patience, that silence, when it carries kindness, can be louder than any voice in the room." Grace blinked back tears as she read. "This office will change because of you. Not because of what was said that day, but because of how you endured it. You didn't demand respect, you inspired it. And that is something no policy can ever create." The words blurred as her eyes filled. She pressed a hand to her heart and smiled softly. It wasn't pride she felt, it was peace, the kind that comes only when pain finally finds its purpose. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside her drawer, beside the notes Ben had left her and the first sticky note she ever wrote on the coffee machine. Together they told the story of something quiet but extraordinary, the triumph of kindness over cruelty. Grace turned off her lamp and looked around the office one last time that evening. The daisies glowed faintly in the dim light, standing tall and bright. They had outlived the storm, just as she had. Outside, the city shimmered, 1,000 lights reflected on the glass, like reminders that even darkness can shine. As she walked toward the elevator, her reflection followed beside her, calm, confident, whole. The doors opened with a soft chime, and she stepped in, holding Nothing but her purse and her peace. She didn't need anything else. In the quiet descent, Grace whispered a final prayer of gratitude for the pain, for the laughter, for the lesson. "Thank you," she said softly, "for reminding me that kindness always comes home." The doors opened, and the world outside greeted her with gentle wind and golden dusk. She paused before leaving, looking once more at her reflection in the glass, and for the first time, she truly saw herself, not as the girl who was mocked, but as the woman who changed everything without ever raising her voice. And as she stepped into the fading light, her story became more than memory. It became a reminder for anyone willing to see that even in the coldest places, a gentle heart can still bloom. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments, like the video, and share it with someone who believes that kindness still matters. Because the world changes, one gentle act at a time.